In this video we are going to take a closer look at some upcoming content that may or may not be interesting for Deathwatch players, worrying about what to do now that the potential expiry date of our Army of Renown is drawing closer and closer. Over the course of the video, we will first take a look at the upcoming Arks of Omen narrative campaign that has been further revealed during the recent Warhammer Online Preview. In the second part, we will then go through relevant Christmas Battleforce boxes, as well as what I would consider safe picks for the Deathwatch in the upcoming months. Lastly, there will be a quick wrap-up of what has been covered.
Welcome to SwissHammer, your channel for modeling in Warhammer 40k. My name is Tammer, and I will be guiding you through this video.
While Space Marines are generally being considered the poster boys of the Warhammer 40k universe, the latest news surrounding the faction have mostly been negative. While new model releases or even updated rules have remained largely absent, the one thing that stood out as of late was their poor win rates in competitive play, as could be seen in the recent MetaWatch coverage on Warhammer community. Anyone hoping for a quick fix, preferably in the Q4 balanced status late, was in for a major disappointment when GW largely excused the poor win rates being caused by new inexperienced players. I have covered the recent MetaWatch debacle in previous videos, the link is in the description. Furthermore, Deathwatch players are dreading January 2023 as it is, with the potential discontinuation of our Army of Renown, the Kill Team Strike Force. No good news on the horizon at all? Well, let's start by taking a look at the content that has been further revealed during the Warhammer Online Preview, the Arks of Omen narrative campaign books. So far, GW has set the roadmap for 4 campaign books, with the first release, Arks of Omen Abaddon, being released before Christmas, which most likely means something like first half of December already. What we know so far is that this will be a narrative campaign, aka no rules for matched play, and they will feature a new standalone game mode called Boarding Actions, which will be limited to 500 points. While we don't yet know the full extent of these rules, it has been confirmed so far that these will be close-quarter battles in the style of Space Hulk board games, and both monsters and vehicles are excluded. Furthermore, the latest article also mentions, and I directly quote, "There is no room for bulky monsters and war machines, nor for burning rubber down tight corridors, or taking to the skies in cramped hallways." While not directly spelled out, this is a fairly clear hint that neither bikers or jump pack infantry will be allowed either. For us Deathwatch players, what should immediately come to mind, of course, is what would this potentially mean for our kill teams and the inclusion of both bikers and jump pack infantry. For bikers in particular, by mixing them with other infantry models, they lose the biker keyword and gain the infantry keyword instead. However, GW has also made special exceptions for boarding transports, for instance, where the biker keyword always applies, aka no boarding drop pods with infantry bikes. The big question at this point is whether GW will immediately fix these Deathwatch rules for boarding actions, or if we get to run a little rampant until the first FAQ drops to correct things. Judging by how they handled the recent Deathwatch exclusion in the Phobos Army of Renown, we now know that they are all too quick with making sure that we cannot pull any unintended shenanigans, but nonetheless, it would be quite hilarious if they would overlook it this time. I guess we will have to wait and see the first iteration of the rules. Having said that, and assuming that Deathwatch will be restricted to the same datasheets as any other chapters, aka no special stunts with bikers or jump pack infantry, how attractive would such 500 points boarding action games be for the Deathwatch? Personally, I have certainly argued in the past that Deathwatch does not scale to well below 2000 points, mainly because of the elite-style army, as well as kill teams unlocking their full potential by going max models, which is in turn quite points intense. There are, however, two advantages regarding boarding actions I would like to highlight. First and perhaps most importantly, what scales even worse than Deathwatch at 500 points is the Deathwatch Army of Renown due to forced specialisms. With already being super tight on points, you really do not want to pay for these on top. This means that the potential loss of our Army of Renown does not really affect boarding actions, as we would not have taken it anyway. Furthermore, some armies can create terrible SKU lists at 500 points, like for instance by bringing a Dreadnought or some other centerpiece along, which will now be excluded due to the previously mentioned datasheet limitations. In turn, the kill teams of the Deathwatch count as troops, and this means we get to bring along more elite battlefield roles in the troop slot, and therefore with OPSEC on top. The unfortunate part, however, is that due to 500 points being quite limited, we will not be able to pull this off with a great many kill teams in the first place, but nonetheless, we should be able to field at least one. My recommendation here would be to go for Proteus kill teams, as these tend to be the most flexible thanks to our Deathwatch veterans. Speaking of which, in close quarter boarding actions, having a default wet with a Deathwatch bolt gun and chainsword strikes me as a pretty solid deal. But anyway, at the current points, which may or may not change for the better in the upcoming Monitorum Field Manual in January, we should be able to rock one modified Costello Clanby style Proteus kill team. For instance, the Biker can be swapped for a Terminator, and the Vanvets can be run without the jump pad, to still be able to circumvent any heavy Thunderhammer restrictions of the default wets. This would still leave points for another squad of Deathwatch veterans, with the default Deathwatch bolt gun and chainsword loadout, assuming that we wanted to also include a cheap captain, for instance the Indomitus captain, that becomes suddenly far more attractive with his decently priced default loadout, as well as the movement being no longer much of an issue. That aside, we could also think about running the HQ super cheap by going for a lieutenant for instance, and I could see the Reaver version as a potential candidate, but this would also depend on how much they let us play with CP in the first place. Speaking of CP, one huge downside would also be the potential loss of our fall back and shoot or charge stratagems, which are tied to bikers and jump packs. Either way, while perhaps not bringing the greatest strength of the faction to bear, I could certainly see Deathwatch as playable for those who wanted to check out the new narrative game mode due to the lack of performance in match play, with the potential loss of the Army of Renown. Also, a great way to get into both the game and the faction as far as I'm concerned. Moving on to the second part, the Christmas Battleforce Boxes, as well as what I would consider the potential safe picks for Deathwatch that should survive the upcoming January rules updates. As was previewed on Warhammer Community, there will be 2 Space Marine boxes for Christmas, one of which is the Imperial Fist themed Bastion Strike Force, and the other is the Raven Guard themed Raven Strike Battle Force. For the Imperial Fists box, we get their named character Thor Garadon, which looks pretty badass, 3 Primaris Aggressors, 15 Heavy Intercessors, as well as a set of Imperial Fists Primaris upgrades and transfers. Now, unless you really have no Gravis models at all, the 15 Heavy Intercessors are complete overkill, even for the Deathwatch, and with hoping for points drops on this datasheet. Or let me phrase it differently, it is highly unlikely that you will ever run more than 2 Indomitor kill teams, which is 10 Heavy Intercessors. If you had none at all, plus would be willing to convert the other 5 into Eradicators, after all, they share the same basic model, they just carry different weapons, this could be worth it, plus Thor Garadon makes for a cool kit bash anyway. On the other hand, the Raven Guard box can be skipped completely, 10 Reavers are between 5 to 10 too many, the 2 Invictor tactical warsuits don't really see play in the Deathwatch, and you can get the 3 Eliminators at a better price in another combat patrol. But Tamer, what if I wanted to spoil myself with a Battleforce box anyway? Well, I provided that one use case for the Imperial Fists one, but if that is no option, I would probably go for the Imperial Knights one, which strikes me as usable for 2 reasons. While perhaps not super competitive, we can now take a single big knight, or up to 3 small ones, as an agent of the Imperium, which locks us out of the Army of Renown, which we might lose anyway, but we still get to keep all else Deathwatch. In case CP gets changed for the better again in the next chapter approved mission pack, this might as well be quite interesting. While I'm not a Knights player, though I do have a Knight Castellan and field for fun games sometimes, all models in the Knights box are perfectly viable based on what I know from current Knights lists, and I think Imperial Knights are a cool second or third or whatever army to have, and they also don't require an awfully high number of models. Anyway, while my heart beats for the Deathwatch, I just wanted to point out what would be my personal pick if I absolutely wanted to make one. Having said that, moving on to what I would consider the safe picks for Deathwatch for the time being. As I covered in my previous video, there will be a bunch of rules changes coming January, including points, mission pack, the balanced status slate, the potential removal of our Army of Renown, aka a lot is up in the air at this point. Looking at boarding actions and our kill teams in general, I think the Proteus kill team in particular will remain our primary pick. The Costello Clangby style kill team has much to offer, and all its datasheets are competitive in the Deathwatch on their own in one way or the other. As always, magnetizing them is the most future-proof option to approach such times of uncertainty. Furthermore, I would also make sure that you have at least the base troops for each of the primary skill teams, though I assume that most experienced players have that anyway. But for beginners in particular, I would not overinvest into any of these base primaries troops for the time being, at least not until the new points values are out. Pretty much anything can happen then. Overall, while much is yet unknown, I am personally looking forward to the Arks of Omen narrative campaign, which will be at least for me a great way to somewhat overcome the potential loss of our Army of Renown, and going back to my very early adventures into the Warhammer 40k universe, when I played the original Space Hulk on both the PC as well as one or the other board game. I also know that several viewers have been interested in 500 points lists. What better opportunity to dig into that? On the match play side of things, even though the recent Metawatch debacle and balanced status slate has been disappointing for Space Marines, GW has by now received quite a bit of backlash and among other things acknowledged that troops' choices in particular seem to struggle. Getting a few tax points off our kill teams would go a long way for our faction. I am keeping my fingers crossed. To wrap things up, over the course of the video, we have looked at the upcoming Arks of Omen narrative campaign, with the first book already being released before Christmas. This will feature the so-called boarding actions, which is a new standalone game mode limited to 500 points and some special rules, for instance excluding both monsters and vehicles, and likely also bikers and jump pack. While we do not yet know the full extent of these rules, Deathwatch with their kill teams counting as troops might be an interesting pick, as we can take more elite datasheets in that slot in addition to our Deathwatch veterans with Deathwatch bolt guns and chainswords being both a decent and affordable pick for such close quarters encounters. While I think that Deathwatch scales the best at 2000 points due to the elite nature of the army, at least the 500 points limit will not make them suffer from the potential loss of the Army of Renown. Furthermore, for those looking to extend their army around Christmas, while the 2 Space Marine Battleforce boxes are not great for Deathwatch, if you happen to own no heavy intercessors at all, the Imperial Fist box could be put to good use. That aside, I personally like the Knights box, which contains both competitive models, and some of these could also be included into a Deathwatch army thanks to the updated Agents of the Imperium rule. Those boxes aside, I personally think that you cannot go wrong with datasheets available to the Proteus skill team at this point, which has been the one constant over the entirety of 9th edition so far. All in all, a lot depends on the upcoming rules changes in January, and I am of course still secretly hoping that we are getting to keep the Army of Renown. GW, if you are hearing me, get it done already. So that's it for the upcoming content that may or may not be interesting for Deathwatch players, worrying about the potential loss of our Army of Renown. Are you guys interested in the upcoming narrative campaign with the boarding actions, or are you going to stick to match play instead? Any plans for your future non-Army of Renown lists? Let me know in the comments. Finally, I would also like to mention that there is a SwissHammer Facebook page where I will be posting links to my videos as well as articles I find of interest. I do read a lot about the hobby, but not all of it will always end up as its own video. I look forward to seeing you there as well. I do also have a Patreon page. If you like my content, any additional support is greatly appreciated as it helps me invest into future videos. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. I hope you have been enjoying this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again and see you next time.